Hey everyone, I need to get this off my chest. I'm Bobby, 38, and for the past 10 years my wife Carol and I have been off-roading with our close friends, Ted and Alice. These trips have been like a second home to us. Weekends away in the mountains, away from everything, just mud, engines and the open sky. Ted and I bonded over fixing up old Jeeps, while Carol and Alice always seem to enjoy each other's company. But lately, something's been off, and I've had this gut feeling that something's going on between Ted and Carol. I started noticing small things. Carol became secretive with her phone, texting late at night when she thought I was asleep. She'd laugh at Ted's jokes in a way she didn't with me, and there was this unspoken tension whenever the four of us were together. But I kept telling myself it was just my imagination. I mean, Carol was my wife. We've been through so much together. There's no way she'd do something like that. Then, Alice came to me one night during one of our off-roading trips. We were sitting by the fire while Ted and Carol had gone off to get more wood, which honestly didn't make much sense. Alice seemed quiet at first, but after a couple of drinks, she dropped a bombshell. She had found emails, long detailed emails, between Ted and Carol, making plans to run off together. And that wasn't the worst of it. They were also planning to frame us, Alice and me, for some sort of financial scam. Something about stolen money from Ted's business that they were going to pin on us before disappearing together. When she told me, it felt like a punch to the gut. I was furious, confused, and sick all at once. I wanted to confront Carol right then, but Alice held me back. She said we needed more proof. If we acted too soon, they'd find a way to turn it around on us. So we made a plan to play it cool. I'd keep pretending everything was normal, but inside, I felt like I was living a nightmare. Alice was holding it together better than I was, but I could tell it was eating her up too. The worst part was having to watch Carol and Ted act like nothing was wrong, like they weren't actively plotting to destroy our lives. But I couldn't give them the satisfaction of knowing I was onto them. So there we were, on this off-roading trip, pretending like nothing had changed. Ted and I spent hours working on our Jeeps, while Carol and Alice kept up their usual chatter. Every now and then, I'd catch Carol glancing at Ted in a way that made my stomach turn, but I couldn't let it show. Alice and I were in this together now, and we couldn't risk tipping them off. Alice had this idea that we should start gathering as much evidence as possible. She suggested keeping copies of the emails and digging through any paperwork that looked suspicious. I didn't know the first thing about financial scams, but Alice had a sharp eye for details. She'd always handled Ted's business finances, so she knew where to look. Meanwhile, I was just trying to keep my cool and not explode every time I saw Carol whispering something to Ted behind my back. One night, after we had packed up for the day, Alice and I sat by the fire again. We didn't say much, just staring into the flames, both of us lost in our own thoughts. It wasn't long before Alice started talking about what she had found so far. Turns out, Ted and Carol had been planning this for a while, months, maybe even a year. They had been siphoning money from one of Ted's accounts, making it look like I was somehow involved. My name was on documents I hadn't even seen before. Alice found the same with her name. They were setting us up, plain and simple. I don't get it, I muttered, shaking my head. Why would Carol do this to me? To us? Alice shrugged, her eyes reflecting the firelight. Greed, maybe? Or they think they'll have this perfect life together. Who knows? But we can't let them get away with it. At that moment, I wanted to get up and storm over to their tent, demand answers, but I knew Alice was right. We needed to wait, to be smart about this. I could feel the anger boiling under my skin, but I had to stay focused. Do you think they'll try something while we're still out here? I asked, more paranoid than ever. Alice shook her head. I don't think so. They probably want to keep up the act until everything's in place. We've got some time. I wasn't so sure. I knew Carol, or at least I thought I did. She was impatient, always looking for the fastest way out of any problem. And Ted? He was cunning, always scheming. They were a dangerous combination. But for now, I had to trust Alice's judgment. We couldn't make a move until we had everything we needed. As the fire crackled between us, I wondered how the hell I was going to get through the rest of this trip without blowing up. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Ted and Carol laughing by the Jeeps. It was like they didn't have a care in the world, like they weren't plotting behind our backs. It made me sick to hear her laughing like that, so carefree. I glanced over at Alice's tent, and she must have been thinking the same thing because she stepped out with this cold, determined look on her face. We didn't say anything about the plan. Couldn't risk it. Ted and Carol were too close, and who knows how much they were paying attention to us. We went through the motions of breakfast, packing up our gear, getting ready for the day's off-roading. Carol barely acknowledged me, her attention focused on Ted. She didn't even try to hide it anymore, and that hurt more than I expected. While we were driving through the rough terrain, I kept thinking about how long this had been going on. How many times had they laughed at me behind my back? How many lies had Carol told me right to my face? Alice must have noticed me stewing in my thoughts because she radioed over, her voice calm but firm. "Bobby, don't let them get to you. We need to stay focused." I gripped the steering wheel tighter, taking a deep breath. I know. It's just hard, you know." "Trust me, I do," Alice replied. "But we've got to play it smart." The rest of the drive was tense. Ted led the way, with Carol in the passenger seat of his Jeep. Alice was riding with me, but neither of us spoke much. I kept watching Ted's Jeep bounce over the rocks ahead, my mind racing with what was coming next. That afternoon, we stopped by a river to cool off. It had been a long, hot day, and the water looked refreshing. Ted and Carol walked ahead, leaving Alice and me behind. I could feel the tension between us, knowing that every second we spent waiting felt like torture. But Alice had been right so far, we needed to bide our time. As we sat on the edge of the riverbank, Alice leaned over, lowering her voice. "I found more last night. Bank statements. They've been moving money slowly, but it's enough to pin the fraud on us." I nodded, though my mind was elsewhere. I kept staring at Ted and Carol, who were splashing around in the water, acting like a couple of teenagers. "We've got to act soon," I muttered. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." Alice put her hand on my shoulder, grounding me. "We will. But we need to be sure. Just a little longer, Bobby." As much as I hated it, I knew she was right. We were close to getting everything we needed. One slip up, and they'd be gone, and we'd be left cleaning up their mess. But damn, it was hard to watch them together, pretending like everything was normal while plotting to ruin us. Later that night, we sat around the campfire again. Ted and Carol were laughing, drinking, and telling stories from our past trips like nothing was wrong. I forced myself to laugh along, even though every part of me wanted to scream. Alice stayed quiet, her eyes flicking between Ted and Carol, calculating. She wasn't much for talking, but I could tell her mind was working overtime. At some point, Carol leaned over and whispered something in Ted's ear, and he smirked. My heart sank. They were planning something. I could feel it. But before I could even react, the weather turned. Fast. One minute we were sitting under a clear sky, and the next, the wind picked up, and clouds rolled in out of nowhere. We barely had time to process what was happening before rain started pouring down, hard. Flash flood. Ted yelled, scrambling to his feet. Everything went to chaos in seconds. The river we had been sitting by earlier was swelling fast, the water rising way quicker than any of us expected. The rain was coming down so fast it was hard to see. One minute, everything was calm, and the next, we were scrambling to pack up and get the hell out of there. The river was rising like crazy, water rushing down from the mountains, flooding everything in sight. Everyone to the jeeps. Ted shouted, his voice barely cutting through the roar of the storm. I grabbed Alice's arm and pulled her toward the vehicles. Carol was already in Ted's jeep, and they were frantically trying to load up their gear. My mind was racing. As much as I hated Ted and Carol right then, this flash flood was serious. People die in these kinds of things if they don't get out fast enough. And no matter what they had planned, we needed to survive this first. Alice and I threw our stuff into the back of my Jeep as fast as we could. The ground was already turning into mud, making it hard to move. The water from the river was creeping closer with every second. We've got to go. I yelled over the storm, my heart pounding. Ted revved his engine, trying to pull out, but the wheels just spun in the mud. I could see the panic on his face, and for a split second, I felt something strange, a weird mix of anger and pity. But there was no time to dwell on that. Come on. I shouted to Ted. Leave the gear, just get in the Jeep and go. But Ted wasn't listening. He and Carol were trying to push the Jeep out, but the mud was thick, and the water was closing in fast. Alice jumped into my Jeep, and I turned the key, praying it would start. It did. Thank God. Bobby, we've got to go now. Alice yelled, her voice sharp with urgency. I hesitated, looking back at Ted and Carol. They were still struggling, shouting at each other, completely ignoring the danger that was right in front of them. The water was almost up to the tires now, and I knew they didn't have much time. But they were too wrapped up in their own mess to realize it. "Leave them," Alice said quietly, her voice cutting through the chaos. "We've got to save ourselves." I knew she was right. But it didn't feel right. I couldn't just leave them there, even after everything they'd done, or were planning to do. I revved the engine again and inched closer to where they were stuck. "Get in!" I shouted through the rain, my voice cracking from the stress. But Ted just waved me off, shouting something I couldn't hear over the storm. Carol was yelling too, trying to push the Jeep, like that was going to make any difference. The river was roaring now, way too close for comfort. "Bobby, it's too late," Alice said, her voice low but firm. "We have to go. Now." I looked at Ted and Carol one last time, my heart pounding in my chest, and then I slammed my foot on the gas. Mud sprayed up behind us as we tore out of there, away from the rising water. My hands were shaking on the wheel, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, but I couldn't see them anymore. The water surged forward, swallowing everything in its path. We drove as fast as we could, the rain pounding on the windshield, but I couldn't stop thinking about what we'd just done. I couldn't believe it. I had left them behind. But as we got higher up the mountain, away from the danger, reality started to set in. Alice was right. There was nothing we could have done. They were too wrapped up in their own disaster to save themselves. We stopped at a safe spot further up the trail. Both of us sat there in silence, the rain still beating down around us. "I can't believe they're gone," Alice whispered, staring out into the darkness. The rain had slowed to a drizzle by the time Alice spoke again. I could barely make out her face in the dim light of the Jeep, but her voice was hollow, like she was trying to process what had just happened. "They're really gone, aren't they?" she whispered, more to herself than to me. I sat there gripping the wheel, my knuckles white. The adrenaline was still pumping through me, but now that we were safe, the weight of everything started crashing down. Ted and Carol, gone. Just like that. I didn't know what to feel. Anger? Relief? Guilt? It was all swirling together, making me feel sick to my stomach. I couldn't wrap my head around the fact that just hours ago, we were sitting around the campfire, and now Ted and Carol were dead, swept away by the flood. "Yeah," I finally muttered. "They're gone." Alice stayed quiet, staring out the window. I could see her hands trembling as she wiped rain off her face, probably trying to keep it together. But I knew she was just as messed up inside as I was. We sat there for a while, not saying much. What was there to say? Part of me felt guilty as hell for driving off without them, but another part, the part that remembered the betrayal, the lies, felt like it was some kind of twisted justice. They had been plotting against us, planning to ruin our lives, and now, nature took care of it for us. But I couldn't shake the guilt. Even after everything they did, or were going to do, I never wanted it to end like this. Alice broke the silence first. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice shaky. I didn't have an answer. Hell, I didn't even know what I was feeling, let alone what we were supposed to do next. I glanced over at her, seeing the exhaustion in her eyes. I realized she had been through just as much as I had, maybe more. Her husband had betrayed her, same as my wife had betrayed me. We were both in this wreckage together now, whether we liked it or not. "We survive," I said, though the words felt empty. "We get through this." Alice nodded, but she didn't seem convinced. Neither was I, really. The rain stopped completely after a while, and everything went eerily quiet. No more roaring river, no more pounding storm. Just the distant sound of the water rushing somewhere far below us. "We should head back to town," Alice finally said. "We need to report what happened." Yeah, I guess we do." I wasn't ready for that. Not ready to face the questions, the looks, the realization that we'd be walking back into a world where Ted and Carol didn't exist anymore. We packed up what little we had left, both of us moving like robots, too drained to think, too numb to feel. The drive back was slow and quiet. We didn't say much, just stared ahead, lost in our thoughts. I kept thinking about all the times Ted and I had worked on our Jeeps together, the laughs we'd shared on these trips, the stupid jokes. And Carol, God, how could she have done this to me? How could she have been planning to run off with Ted and ruin my life? It felt surreal. Like none of it was real. But it was. And now they were gone, leaving nothing but wreckage behind. By the time we reached town, it was late, and everything was dark. I parked the Jeep outside the sheriff's office, the engine ticking in the silence. Neither of us moved for a long time. "Are you ready for this?" I asked quietly. Alice looked over at me, her eyes filled with exhaustion and pain. "No," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But we don't have a choice." We stepped out of the Jeep, our feet heavy, and walked into the station. The sheriff's office was dimly lit, the kind of place that feels both too quiet and too heavy. Alice and I stepped inside, dripping from the storm, and the reality of everything started to settle in even deeper. A deputy at the front desk gave us a once-over before standing up slowly. "Can I help you folks?" he asked, eyeing us with suspicion. We must have looked like hell, muddy, soaked and broken. I swallowed hard, unsure where to even start. "We've just come back from the mountains," I said, my voice hoarse. There was a flash flood. 2 people, our friends Ted and Carol, they didn't make it. The words felt strange, like I was talking about someone else's life. I glanced at Alice, who was pale and silent beside me, her arms crossed tightly over her chest like she was trying to hold herself together. The deputy's face shifted immediately. "A flood," he repeated, already moving to grab his radio. "You two okay? Where are the others?" Alice looked down, and I stepped forward, forcing the words out. "They didn't make it. Ted and Carol, they got caught in the flood. We tried to help, but I trailed off, the weight of it all crushing down on me." All right, hold on," the deputy said, waving his hand like he was trying to process the information. He grabbed the radio from his belt and started calling in backup. Within minutes, other officers were bustling around, making calls, grabbing maps, and asking us more questions than I had answers for. I did my best to explain what had happened, how the rain came out of nowhere, how we tried to get out, how Ted's Jeep got stuck in the mud. But no matter how I tried to explain it, it didn't feel real. Alice barely said a word, just nodded along with what I said, looking like she was lost in her own world. I didn't blame her. We were both just trying to survive this. After what felt like hours, the sheriff himself came out, an older guy with a weathered face and a slow, steady way of talking. He led us into a small room with a table and a couple of chairs, shutting the door behind us to give us some privacy. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, sitting down across from us. "I know this is a tough situation, but we need to understand exactly what happened out there." Alice sat down, staring at her hands, while I tried to gather myself enough to respond. "We were camping," I began, my voice cracking a little. "Everything was fine until the storm hit. We knew the river was dangerous, but it came up so fast. There was no time." The sheriff nodded slowly, taking notes, but there was something in his eyes. He wasn't just listening to the story. He was piecing together something else, and it made my skin crawl. "You said you and Ted were friends for a long time," he asked. "Yeah, about 10 years, I said, though my voice didn't hold much confidence. Saying we were friends felt like a lie now. "And your wife, Carol, she was close with Ted too?" I froze. Alice stiffened beside me. I wasn't sure how much he knew or if this was just routine, but the question hit harder than I expected. "Yeah," I muttered, trying to keep my face neutral. "We all were. We spent a lot of time together." The sheriff nodded again, scribbling something down. "It's just, sometimes when people lose someone, especially in an accident like this, there are details that don't add up right away. We'll need to investigate to make sure there was nothing unusual about the situation." I could feel Alice tense up even more. My heart started racing. Was he suspicious of us? Did he think we had something to do with their deaths? I mean, sure, we were angry, but we didn't do anything to cause that flood. "We understand," Alice finally said, her voice surprisingly calm despite the situation. "We just want to do what's right." The sheriff studied us for a moment, then stood up, sliding his notebook into his pocket. "We'll be in touch. For now, try to rest. We'll be heading out to the mountains tomorrow morning to search for the bodies. It's going to be a long process." As we stood to leave, I felt this creeping dread in my chest. We had gotten through the flood, but now there was something else hanging over us, a shadow we couldn't shake. Alice must have felt it too, because as soon as we stepped outside, she turned to me, her face pale and serious. "They're going to dig into everything, Bobby," she said, her voice low. "We need to be ready. If they find out about the emails, the scam, who knows what they'll think." I hadn't even thought of that. Ted and Carol weren't just victims of the flood, they were criminals, planning to ruin our lives. If the sheriff found that out, Who knew what kind of questions they'd start asking? And with them dead, the story would look worse for us. What do we do? I asked, feeling panic rising in my throat. Alice looked me dead in the eye, her face hard. We don't let them find out. We keep everything buried. After we left the sheriff's office, we sat in the Jeep for a long time, the silence between us thick. The rain had finally stopped, but it felt like the weight of everything was still pressing down on us. Alice stared out the window, her face pale and tight with worry. I was just trying to keep my head from spinning. We need to be smart about this, Alice said quietly, finally breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, but there was a tension underneath it. They're going to start digging around, asking questions. If they find out about Ted and Carol's plan, they might think we were in on it. She was right. With Ted and Carol gone, there was no one left to blame, and if the police found out about the emails or the money transfers, they'd think Alice and I were the ones pulling the strings. Hell, maybe they'd even think we had something to do with their deaths. What do we do? I asked, the panic rising in my chest. I mean, what can we do now? We have to get rid of anything that could connect us to their plan, Alice said, her voice steady but firm. The emails, the documents, anything that ties us to their scam. I blinked, trying to wrap my head around it. We were talking about covering up evidence. That was a whole different level of trouble, but she wasn't wrong. If anyone found those emails or the financial records Ted had set up, they'd see our names all over it. It wouldn't matter that we had nothing to do with their scheme. They left stuff at the campsite, Alice continued, her eyes finally meeting mine. We need to go back up there before the police do. Get rid of anything that could point to us. I took a deep breath, the weight of what she was saying sinking in. You're sure we can do this? We don't have a choice, Bobby, she said, her voice suddenly hard. If we don't clean this up, they'll pin everything on us. And with Ted and Carol dead, we won't have a way to prove our innocence. It's our word against whatever they find. I nodded slowly, my mind racing. Alice was right, we had to get ahead of this. If the sheriff started looking into the scam and found those emails, it wouldn't matter that Ted and Carol were the ones behind it. Alice and I would look guilty by association. We go back first thing in the morning, I agreed, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Before anyone else gets there. Alice leaned back in her seat, staring out at the dark streets of the small town. We'll figure this out, she said, though I wasn't sure if she was saying it to reassure me or herself. The next morning, we were up early, neither of us saying much as we packed up and headed back to the campsite. My gut was in knots the whole drive, and I kept glancing over at Alice, who looked just as tense. I wasn't sure what we were walking into, but I knew we didn't have much time before the authorities showed up to start their investigation. As we neared the campsite, the aftermath of the flash flood was everywhere. Mud caked the ground, branches and debris scattered all over the place. It looked like the storm had ripped through, leaving nothing untouched. Ted's Jeep was still there, half buried in the mud. Just seeing it again sent a chill down my spine, a reminder of how close everything had come to disaster. We parked the Jeep a little ways off and walked the rest of the way. The ground was slick, making it hard to move quickly, but neither of us said a word as we headed for Ted and Carol's tent. Everything felt heavy, the air, the silence, the weight of what we were about to do. Alice pulled back the flap of their tent, and inside was a mess. Clothes, gear, papers, all scattered from when they'd been scrambling to pack up the night before the flood hit. My heart raced as I stepped inside, looking for anything that could connect us to their plan. Here, Alice muttered, crouching down by Ted's duffel bag. She pulled out a small folder, flipping through it quickly. Her face went pale. This is it. All the bank statements, transfers, everything. I crouched beside her, my hands trembling as I glanced at the papers. It was all there, proof of what Ted and Carol had been planning. Money moved between accounts, some in Ted's name, some in mine, and others in Alice's. It was all part of their scam, designed to frame us for the fraud. We need to burn this, Alice said, her voice cold and matter-of-fact. If they find this, it's over for us. I nodded, my mouth dry. I knew she was right. We had no choice. But it didn't make it any easier. Destroying the evidence felt like stepping into a darker world, one where we weren't just victims anymore, we were covering up a crime. We gathered everything, papers, documents, anything that could tie us to their plan. Alice had even found Ted's phone, which still had those emails from Carol. We didn't speak as we threw it all into a pile, our faces grim. We'll burn it here, Alice said quietly, pulling out a lighter from her bag. Get rid of it all. As she set the flame to the papers, I watched the edges curl and blacken, the fire spreading quickly through the stack. It was done. All the proof of their betrayal, their scam, gone in a pile of ash. But even as the flames died down, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. It didn't feel like we were free. If anything, it felt like we were sinking even deeper into a mess we couldn't escape. We did what we had to do, Alice said, standing up, her face hard as she stared at the smoldering ashes. I nodded, but the knot in my stomach only tightened. We might have destroyed the evidence, but that didn't mean the truth was gone. As the fire smoldered, Alice and I stood there in silence, watching the last bits of paper crumble into ash. My heart was still pounding, even though we'd done what we came to do. The proof of their betrayal was gone, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt more like we'd just crossed a line we could never uncross. Now what? I asked, my voice rough. Alice kicked at the dirt, eyes still on the blackened pile. We go back. Act like none of this ever happened. We tell them the truth about the flood, about Ted and Carol getting caught in it. That's all they need to know. I nodded, but my thoughts were swirling. Was it really going to be that simple? We could explain the flood easily enough, but what if the sheriff's department dug deeper? What if they asked the wrong questions or found something we hadn't thought of? But Alice seemed focused. She had this cold determination about her that I hadn't seen before, like all her fear and shock had hardened into steel. We have to stick to the same story, Bobby, she said, turning to face me. No matter what happens, we don't mention anything about the emails, the scam, nothing. Ted and Carol died in a freak flood. That's the end of it. I swallowed hard. You're right. We just stick to the story. Alice nodded, then turned toward Ted's Jeep, still half buried in the mud. We can't leave that here. It'll raise too many questions. She was right. If the sheriff's team found Ted's Jeep stuck in the mud, they'd start wondering why we didn't try to get it out. The fact that we drove away and left them would look suspicious as hell. I'll drive it, I said, even though I didn't want to. The thought of getting behind the wheel of Ted's Jeep, where he and Carol had probably made all their plans, made me feel sick. But Alice was already grabbing her stuff, not giving me a chance to back out. After a bit of work, we managed to get Ted's Jeep unstuck. The mud was thick, but with the two of us pushing, it finally broke free. I got in, the seat damp and cold, and started it up. The engine growled to life, and I gripped the wheel tight, trying to push down the mix of anger and grief boiling inside me. Alice followed behind me in my Jeep as we made our way back down the trail. The drive was slow and tense. Every turn, every bump in the road, made me think about Ted and Carol, about how they'd planned to ruin us. It was hard to imagine they were really gone, swept away by the very river they'd been so careless around. When we finally hit the main road leading back into town, I pulled over, needing a minute to collect myself. Alice pulled up beside me and got out, walking over to the driver's side of Ted's Jeep. "You good?" she asked, her eyes scanning my face. I nodded, even though I wasn't sure if I was. Just needed a second. She gave me a tight smile, then nodded. "Once we get back to town, this is over. We play it cool, stick to our story, and let the sheriff do his job. They won't find anything." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that we could bury all of this with Ted and Carol, that their deaths would take the truth with them. But a part of me knew that things were never going to be that simple. Still, we didn't have a choice. We had to keep moving. So I started the Jeep back up, following Alice down the road toward town, hoping to God we could pull this off. We rolled back into town just before noon, the sun finally breaking through the clouds as if nothing had happened. But for us, everything had changed. My hands were still gripping the wheel tight as I pulled Ted's Jeep into a parking spot by the sheriff's office. Alice parked next to me, and we both just sat there for a minute, neither of us eager to get out. "You ready for this?" she asked, glancing over at me. Her voice was calm, but I could see the tension in her eyes. "Yeah," I muttered, though I wasn't sure if I meant it. We climbed out of the Jeeps and walked toward the entrance. The air felt heavy, even with the sun shining now. I couldn't stop thinking about how we just burned the only evidence of Ted and Carol's betrayal. But Alice was right, we had to act like none of that mattered now. We were just two people who'd survived a tragedy, nothing more. Inside, the sheriff's office was busy. A few deputies were milling around, and the sheriff himself was talking to one of them by the door. As soon as he saw us, he motioned us over, his face hard to read. Bobby, Alice, he said, nodding to each of us. We've got a team heading up to the campsite now to look for the bodies. Anything else we need to know before they go? I swallowed hard, shaking my head. No, nothing. We told you everything yesterday. The flood hit fast, and Ted's Jeep got stuck. We barely made it out. Alice stood beside me, silent, but she gave a small nod of agreement. The sheriff eyed us for a moment, as if he was trying to read something in our faces, but then he just sighed. All right. We'll let you know as soon as we have anything to report. He didn't say it, but I knew what he meant. As soon as they found Ted and Carol's bodies. The thought of that made my stomach turn. Thanks, Sheriff, Alice said quietly. We'll be waiting. We turned to leave, but just as we reached the door, the sheriff called after us. Hey, one more thing. I stopped, glancing over my shoulder. Yeah. We'll need a statement from both of you later, just to make sure everything's in order for the report. Nothing too formal, just a follow-up. My heart skipped a beat, but I forced a nod. Sure, whatever you need. We walked out into the bright sunlight, the warmth almost mocking after everything we'd been through. I could feel the tension in Alice as we reached the cars. She stood still for a second, staring at the ground before looking up at me. A statement, she muttered, almost to herself. We have to stick to the same story. I know, I said, feeling the weight of it all pressing down. We will. Alice let out a long breath, then looked me in the eye. There's no going back now, Bobby. We've done everything we can. All we can do is keep it together and hope nothing slips through the cracks. I nodded, even though the knot in my stomach wouldn't go away. We were in deep now, and there was no way out but forward. The rest of the day dragged on like a bad dream. After leaving the sheriff's office, Alice and I went back to our separate places, both of us trying to keep it together, but the weight of everything hung heavy in the air. I couldn't stop thinking about the statement we'd have to give. What if we messed up? What if we didn't stick to the story perfectly? My mind kept spinning with worst-case scenarios. I spent most of the afternoon sitting in my living room, staring at my phone, waiting for a call from the sheriff's office. Alice had texted me once, just a simple, "We'll be okay." But I wasn't so sure. By the time evening rolled around, I couldn't sit still anymore. I needed to get out, clear my head. I grabbed my keys and headed over to the only place I thought I might find some comfort, the garage where Ted and I used to work on our Jeeps. It was a small rundown place we'd rented together just outside of town. A spot we called our off-roading HQ. Now, walking in there felt different. Empty. The garage smelled like oil and old tools, and for a second, I could almost imagine Ted standing there, laughing about some busted part we'd been fixing. The reality that he was gone, dead in that river, hit me again like a punch to the gut. I leaned against the workbench, trying to breathe through it. I started pacing, running my hand through my hair. My mind wouldn't stop replaying the last few days. Ted's betrayal, the flood, and the fire we lit to destroy everything that could come back on us. It all felt so surreal. How had things gone so wrong so fast? Before I could spiral too far, the sound of a car pulling up outside snapped me back. I turned, peeking out the garage window, and saw Alice stepping out of her Jeep. I hadn't expected her, but I wasn't surprised either. She probably couldn't stand sitting at home, just like me. She walked in, her face pale but determined. "I figured I'd find you here," she said, giving me a tired half-smile. I shrugged. Just needed to get out of the house. Can't sit still. Same, Alice said, walking over to the workbench and leaning against it beside me. Any word from the sheriff yet? Nothing, I muttered. They're probably still up at the site. Or maybe they're waiting to see if we'll slip up. Alice bit her lip, her eyes dark with worry. We won't. We can't. We stood there in silence for a while, both of us lost in our thoughts. The garage felt colder now, emptier, without Ted's presence looming large like it used to. I'd never realized how much of a shadow he cast until he wasn't there anymore. What happens after all this? I asked, breaking the silence. Once they find the bodies, once they get our statements, what happens next? Alice looked at me, her eyes heavy with the same uncertainty I felt. We move on, she said softly, though her voice wavered. We pick up the pieces and keep going. We survive this, Bobby. We have to. I nodded, though I wasn't sure what moving on even looked like anymore. The next morning came too soon. I barely slept, the weight of everything pressing down on me, but I forced myself up and out of the house. Alice and I were scheduled to meet with the sheriff that afternoon to give our statements. The drive to the sheriff's office felt like it took forever, even though it was only a few minutes away. My mind wouldn't stop racing. What if we said the wrong thing? What if they found something we missed? When I pulled into the parking lot, Alice was already there, sitting in her Jeep, staring straight ahead. I parked next to her and got out. She didn't say anything at first, just gave me a look that said everything. She was just as scared as I was. "You ready for this?" she finally asked, her voice quiet but steady. "As ready as I'll ever be," I muttered. We walked into the sheriff's office together. The atmosphere inside felt heavier than before. The deputies moved around, busy with their own tasks, but every now and then, I'd catch one of them glancing our way. Like they knew more than we did, like they were waiting for something. The sheriff came out and led us into a small room. It was just like before, 2 chairs, a table, and that same knot in my stomach. We sat down, Alice to my right, and the sheriff pulled out his notebook, sitting across from us with a blank expression. "We've got the initial reports back from the site," he said, his tone measured. "The flood definitely did some damage, but there's still no sign of the bodies yet. The water must have carried them farther downstream than we thought." I swallowed hard, trying not to let the panic show. No bodies. That meant no closure. That meant this nightmare wasn't over yet. The sheriff didn't seem too bothered though. He scribbled something in his notebook and looked up at us. "We'll keep searching. In the meantime, I'd like to get your official statements about what happened that night." Alice straightened in her chair, and I followed her lead, knowing this was the moment we'd been dreading. We had to get everything right. Every detail. She went first, calmly explaining how the storm hit, how the water rose too fast, how Ted and Carol were stuck while we managed to get away. She told the story exactly how we'd planned it, her voice steady but not too rehearsed. She was good at this. Too good. When it was my turn, I kept my voice as even as I could, repeating the same story. The storm, the rising water, Ted's Jeep getting stuck. I told the sheriff how we tried to help, but the flood came so fast we had no choice but to leave. The sheriff nodded, listening carefully, jotting down notes. His face didn't give anything away, but every time he paused, my heart would skip a beat. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "It sounds like a terrible situation. Flash floods can be deadly, no doubt about that. You're both lucky to have made it out." I nodded, though I didn't feel lucky. Not at all. The sheriff closed his notebook and gave us a small, tight smile. "Thanks for your cooperation. We'll keep searching for Ted and Carol. If anything else comes up, we'll let you know." That was it. It was over, just like that. Alice and I stood up, thanked him, and walked out of the room, our footsteps heavy as we made our way back to the parking lot. Once outside, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "That's done at least," I muttered. Alice looked over at me, her face pale but calm. "Yeah, but we're not in the clear yet, Bobby. They still haven't found the bodies. Until they do, we're stuck in this limbo." She was right. As much as I wanted to believe that giving our statements was the end of it, I knew deep down that it wasn't. Not until Ted and Carol were found. Not until the whole thing was officially closed. "We just have to keep playing it cool," Alice said, her voice steady but filled with that same cold determination I'd seen in her before. "They'll find the bodies eventually, and when they do, we need to make sure nothing else slips through." I nodded, even though the knot in my stomach hadn't gone away. It felt like we were walking a tightrope, and any wrong move could send us falling into a mess we couldn't get out of. "We'll get through this," Alice said, her eyes locking onto mine. "We have to." I wasn't sure if she was saying it for me or for herself, but either way, I knew we didn't have any other choice. A few days passed, but every second felt like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Alice and I had done everything we could to cover our tracks, and the sheriff hadn't called us back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still looming over us. With Ted and Carol's bodies still missing, it felt like this was far from over. I tried to go about life as usual, work, errands, anything to keep my mind off the nightmare. But no matter what I did, it always came back to the same thing. Ted and Carol were out there somewhere, and until they were found, there'd be no closure. Then one evening, just as I was settling in for what I hoped would be a quiet night, my phone rang. My heart jumped into my throat when I saw Alice's name flash on the screen. "Bobby," she said as soon as I picked up, her voice tight and urgent. "You need to come over. Now." My stomach dropped. "What's going on?" Did something happen? It's the sheriff, she whispered. He's here. They found something. For a moment, I felt like the world stopped spinning. I couldn't think straight. I'll be there in 5, I said, grabbing my keys and heading out the door without another word. The drive to Alice's place felt like it took forever, even though I was speeding the whole way. When I pulled up to her house, I saw the sheriff's car parked out front, and my heart started racing. This was it. The moment we'd been dreading. I walked up to the porch, my legs feeling like they might give out at any second. Alice was standing by the door, her face pale but composed. She gave me a quick nod, silently telling me to keep it together. We had to stay calm, no matter what. The sheriff was sitting at her kitchen table, flipping through his notebook. He glanced up when I walked in, giving me a nod, but there was something different in his eyes this time. Something sharp. "Bobby," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Thanks for coming." I forced myself to nod, swallowing the lump in my throat. "What's going on?" "We've made some progress in the search," the sheriff said, his voice casual, but his eyes never left mine. "We found a few things downstream, pieces of debris, some gear. Ted's wallet." I felt the blood drain from my face, but I tried to keep my expression neutral. "His wallet?" The sheriff nodded slowly, flipping through his notes. "Yeah. Along with some personal items that were clearly his. We haven't found the bodies yet, but we're getting closer. It's only a matter of time." Alice and I exchanged a quick glance. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might explode. What did this mean? Were they getting suspicious? Were they just trying to pressure us? "Thing is," the sheriff continued, tapping his pen on the table, "we found some things that don't quite add up." My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" He looked between Alice and me, his eyes sharp as ever. There were some inconsistencies with the way the campsite was left. It didn't look like a clean escape. It looked more like a rush to get out. "We know the storm came fast, but something about the scene isn't sitting right." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. It was chaos. "We barely got out in time." The sheriff nodded, his gaze still heavy on us. "Right. But I'll need to go over your statements again, just to make sure everything lines up." Alice, to her credit, didn't flinch. She sat up straight and nodded calmly. "Of course, Sheriff. We'll help however we can." I tried to do the same, but inside, everything was falling apart. This wasn't over. It was only getting worse. The sheriff's words kept replaying in my head, inconsistencies. As soon as he left Alice's house, the tension in the room exploded. Alice sank into her chair, her face pale, breathing heavily. "They're getting closer," she whispered, her voice shaky. "He knows something's off." I leaned against the wall, my mind spinning. What if they find something else? I asked, the fear creeping into my voice. What if they figure it all out? Alice stood up, pacing back and forth. "We can't let that happen. We've come too far, Bobby. We just need to stick to our story. No matter what." I nodded, trying to believe her. But the sheriff's visit had rattled both of us. Every minute, it felt like the walls were closing in. We had destroyed the evidence, but the truth, their affair, the scam, still felt like it was lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. Alice stopped pacing and looked at me, her face hard. "We've got to keep it together. No matter what they ask, we don't change a thing." She was right, but the knot in my stomach told me this wasn't going to be that simple. The next few days were pure agony. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would race, expecting it to be the sheriff calling with more questions or worse, news that they'd found something we missed. Alice and I kept in touch, but we both knew we couldn't talk too much or it'd look suspicious. Every conversation felt strained, like we were trying to hold back the panic that was constantly creeping in. Then late one evening, just as I was about to try and get some sleep, my phone rang. It was Alice. "They found them," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. My stomach dropped. "Ted and Carol?" "Yeah. Downstream, tangled in debris." There was a pause, and I could hear the fear in her voice. "The sheriff's coming by tomorrow. We need to be ready, Bobby." I sat down heavily, the weight of it all crashing over me. This was it. The bodies had been found. Now the real questions would start. "What do we do?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "We stick to the story," Alice said firmly, though I could hear the cracks in her calm. "We don't change anything. Ted and Carol were caught in the flood, and we tried to help. That's it. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. My mind was racing, but I knew Alice was right. We'd come too far to slip now. The sheriff would come, ask his questions, and we'd give the same answers. The same story we'd told from the beginning. But as I hung up the phone, that knot in my stomach tightened. The bodies were found, but that didn't mean the truth was buried with them.